Fantastic. It's great to be with everybody this evening. I always love coming out to Rockliff and joining you all tonight. We're going to be continuing our study of great women in the Bible. And the particular woman we're going to be talking about tonight, there is not a whole lot said about her in Scripture. And so here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do first is try to just contextualize the environment that she was in and maybe understand how our own situations relate to the situation of the woman that we're going to be looking at in some ways. Then we're going to be looking at some things that we can learn from this woman. Her name is Jochebed, and how we can basically apply those things to our lives and help those to change the perspective or help guide the perspective that we have toward a lot of the things that we see going on in society around us even today. So we're going to be trying to draw some parallels here between what happens in the story of Jochebed and the story of our own lives today. Jochebed is the mother of Moses, and pretty much everything, with just a few exceptions, that we know about Jochebed comes from one place. It's Genesis chapter 2. So if you want to take your Bibles and turn to the very beginning of Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2. So turn to the very beginning of Exodus, and we're going to start looking at Exodus chapter 1 just to sort of contextualize the things that are going on here, and then we'll move on to chapter 2 and look at this woman Jochebed and the great role that she played in the plan of God. A little background, just to sort of understand the situation that the nation of Israel has found themselves in here in Egypt at the beginning of Exodus. We know about Abraham. Probably many of us, or maybe most of us, know about Abraham and how God made promises to Abraham, who was a faithful servant of His, that He was going to bless the world through Abraham's descendants. And there were a few different components that went into that. One of those was that He was going to make a huge nation out of the descendants of Abraham. And we certainly see that throughout history, how the nation of Israel grew and still exists today from Abraham and Sarah, his wife. That great nation promise was fulfilled. He also made Abraham a promise at the time that they were going to inherit the land of Canaan. And that was the land that existed between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. It's modern-day Israel and Palestine. But that land was going to be inherited by Abraham, and that promise was fulfilled as well in the past. We also read about how Abraham was going to have the entire world blessed through his seed, and that is through his descendant. And we know today that doesn't refer to just any old descendant of Abraham, but it refers to God Himself, become flesh, born of a virgin, Jesus Christ. Jesus was a descendant of Abraham by blood and is a fulfillment of that promise to him. Now, in fulfilling that promise, Abraham's family went through a lot of different twists and turns. We know who Abraham's son is, Isaac, and his grandson Jacob. Both of that child and then that grandchild had those promises passed down to him, where God basically said, I made these promises to your father, and I'm going to fulfill them through you and your descendants. He said that to Isaac. Then He said the same thing to Jacob. Made these promises to Abraham. These promises are going to be fulfilled through you, Jacob, and your descendants. At that time, they are living in that land, that promised land, but they are sojourners there. Okay? They are not the primary residents of Canaan initially. And at one point in their history, there's a great famine throughout the world, apparently, at the time. But through God's providence, He provides, through one of the sons of Jacob, He provides for the world through the nation of Egypt. And He has Jacob's son Joseph end up being a servant in Egypt who comes up with this great plan that he presents to Pharaoh. They store up grain during 7 years of plenty, having received direction from God that there was going to be a famine that followed. And so they were prepared for that. And then the entire world turned to Egypt for help during that period of time. And what ended up happening with Jacob and his descendants is that they moved to Egypt because of the great work that Joseph had done and the great service that he had rendered to God and the great blessing that God had given him in being basically a salvation to the world at the time from the great suffering that they had as a result of that famine. Joseph was a hero, really, in the world at that time. But the Bible tells us at the beginning of Exodus that it didn't take long for Egypt to forget about the great things that Joseph had done for them. Let's look at Exodus chapter 1, and we'll start reading in verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. So, this probably takes place, and we're not going to get too much into all the dating here, but you can go into Scripture and really figure out just about a pretty close estimate, maybe even an exact number of years that they spent in Egypt during their slavery, and about how many years it was from the time that they entered till the time that this particular event took place. This would have been a little bit more than 100 years after that family had moved to Egypt, probably somewhere around 135 years. And it's pretty reasonable to assume that the population of Israel, considering the fact that we know about how many there were when they exited Egypt, somewhere over 1 million people, and we know about how many there were when they entered Egypt, it's pretty reasonable to expect that there were several 100,000 of the Israelites in the land of Egypt and the surrounding areas at the time. The king of Egypt obviously viewed it as a threat. He thought, these people are going to be a problem for me, and I better do something about it. Not very wise man, but what he ended up doing was basically making them slaves. And so he appoints Egyptians to basically rule over them and to demand that they labor on behalf of the nation. Previously, they were shepherds living in the surrounding lands. At least that's what they were initially when they moved there. So we can only presume that perhaps they were continuing to do that up until the point that they were enslaved to Egypt. Let's continue reading in verse 15 and following. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded his people, saying, every son who is born to you, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So this just keeps getting worse and worse. Not only did he make them slaves in Egypt, but as they continued to grow and multiply, now he certainly recognized that they probably have some animosity toward him for the suffering that he's putting them through. And so he basically commands for some population control. We're going to start killing babies in order to control the population here of this particular nation. Any sons that they bear, he tells all the midwives, those that are going to go and assist in those births, if it's a son, you're going to just put him to death. And so that's an instruction from the king. That's not something you can just ignore. However, what I want us to do before we get into the specifics of what Shiphrah and Puah did and then move on to what happened with Jochebed in the next chapter, I want us to imagine living in a world like this. Can you imagine being in a world where the edict of the king is that the babies should be slain, where there is that little respect for life as it enters into this world? What I want to suggest to you is that the society that they lived in really isn't that different from ours. I want to talk a little bit about abortion and how that parallels the things that are taking place in Egypt at this time. Let's start with China. China is infamous for that one-child law, right? If you're going to have multiple children, you have to pay a big fine. It's very expensive to have multiple children. And they do that to control their population. And you've probably heard that maybe China has some laws in place that mandate abortions at various periods of time. It's actually not true. Okay? It's actually against the law to require and to force a woman into an abortion. That said, they still receive very strong pressure from the government to do that. To participate in that practice of killing that second child. It's looked down upon in society, and some of, from what I understand, some of the larger government in China pressures the local officials to kind of stay on top of that in their communities and to make sure that families are not overpopulating that society. Pretty terrible things that take place. In June of 2012, there was a story that went around the internet. The woman's name, I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, but I think it's something like Feng Jianmai, 7 months pregnant. And she did not pay the fine that was required of those who are going to have a second child. And so they forced an abortion. And there were some pictures that went around the internet of the stillborn baby that resulted from that. A pretty terrible news story that went around. Really is just atrocious and despicable. There have been stories from refugees that have left North Korea and gone into China. When that happens, the Chinese government will often put them into prison. And there are many rumors and tales about how the Chinese government will take those North Korean women when they are pregnant or when they get pregnant and force abortions upon them while they are imprisoned in that nation. So pretty terrible things that go on in that area of the world as far as the respect for new life is concerned. David Dalydin. I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce his name or not. David Dalydin. Have you heard of the Center of Medical Progress? This started coming about on the internet. We started seeing a lot of videos get released by this nonprofit organization called the Center of Medical Progress. And David was apparently the driving force behind that put all that together. Really, really disgusting and disturbing videos where they had basically posed before Planned Parenthood, infamous for the number of abortions that they execute in this country. He posed, along with others in his organization, as Biomax Procurement Services and went to all these Planned Parenthood outfits and would talk to different high-up executives within Planned Parenthood, trying to basically win over, not really, because he was just pretending to do this, but trying to win over the ability to buy baby parts for experimentation and research from women that were having abortions. Now, the fact that procurement services like that exist wasn't even the story here, okay? Everybody already knew that. That happens, and that's legal. For an organization to go in and to work within a facility that is killing babies upon the thousands, and to take those parts and to use them for experimentation and research, it's sick and it's disgusting and it's not even illegal. But what these videos really were out to expose was that there were reports of babies that were being born alive and dissected with their hearts still beating, in order that these parts were the freshest possible for these organizations that were that were procuring them and doing whatever research that they were doing with them. We saw reports about how they would modify their procedures and change the most efficient way to do an abortion into sort of a way that would preserve that fetus as best possible. Sort of a lot of those videos centered around, can we ever get a full fetus? Can we ever get the whole baby all at once and have that shipped off to us to be able to research? And they're bartering on prices for these things and talking about, well, what kind of compensation can you give us for this? And that part was illegal as well, where they were compensated not just for reimbursing costs for their services. They were actually trying to make more profit for different parts than other parts, where they were trying to be able to get more profit for the types of things that they were able to receive, and basically trying to get the business of receiving these fetuses by offering more money than some of the other organizations were. It all got shoveled under the rug. First videos had probably 1 million views, and by the end of it, hardly 2,000 or 3,000 people would watch these things. Some of it maybe because it's disturbing to watch, but some of it too because people just don't care that these things go on in society. Now maybe this is a little bit different than Egypt, but I want to, I'm going to see if, I don't get great service in here. I want to talk to you about some numbers here, if I can get this page to load. Numberofabortions.com, good go-to resource if you ever want to know the extent of the destruction that's happening in our society right now. Here's some numbers. This is a clock. It's an abortion clock that basically just updates based on statistics, based on reported legal abortions that we know take place in the U.S. and the world. Here's some numbers for you. In the U.S. since 1973, Roe v. Wade, where abortion was declared by the courts to be a right of women, 59,211,533 babies have been killed. 59 million. You know what the U.S. population is right now? It's about 318 million. It means a seventh of our population has been subjected to murder. Can you imagine if we had a natural disaster that wiped out a seventh of the U.S. population? Can you imagine if we had a terrorist attack that wiped out a seventh of the U.S. population? Or if there was a disease, and since 1973, a seventh of the U.S. population had been killed by this disease, and it was still spreading and growing more and more severe? That's what's taking place with the abortions that are done in our society, in our culture. Let me show you some other numbers here. Worldwide, since 1980, this one really blew me away. I've known that U.S. number for a while. 1,422,940 babies have been brutally murdered through abortion. I don't even know how to fathom that number. 1.4 billion little humans have just been mutilated and tossed aside as if they're nothing. Since I loaded this page, 149. Maybe it's a little different than Egypt. We don't have a king that has forced us to send our babies into the Nile. But we do have some parallels to that as well. We don't have a governmental mandate for the death of our children. But we do have women that are pressured by their parents and their friends and their boyfriends and their husbands and their counselors that they're going to be better off if they just kill their children. Conservative groups have estimated that more than half of the abortions in the U.S. are largely a result of women that may not have initially wanted to have an abortion, but were pressured by those around them to do that. And I want us to be a little careful here because it doesn't excuse the women who are making those choices at the end of the day, the fact that they've received some pressure from the outside. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But I do want to point out that there are many ways that even the pro-life movements in this country are really filled with a lot of hypocrisy and inconsistency on this issue. You can't hardly be a politician in this country and win pro-life support unless you say, you know what, abortion's wrong unless you've been raped or unless there's incest. I'll tell you what, that undermines the fundamental argument against abortion to begin with. If these lives are humans, if these children are humans, if they have the rights that humans have, if they are valued by God, it doesn't matter what brought them into this world. An unborn child who's a result of rape or incest has no difference as far as their humanity is concerned and right to life is concerned as somebody who's been born into the world and is now 30 or 40 or 50 years old as a result of rape or incest. There's no difference. And pro-choice advocates know this, and they will write about it. You can read some of the arguments against pro-life, and that's one of the main things is they can point out that hypocrisy in the pro-life movement. That you don't really respect life itself. You just think that the line that you draw is better than the line that I draw. And they're right. They're right. We don't have the right to draw lines as regards to which lives are valuable because every life is valuable. There's a lack of respect for human life in our society, and we see that in the abortions that take place. There is a society that we live in that rejects the morality that God provides, that exalts their own ability to determine who has the right to live and who has the right to die, what is right and what is wrong. We live in a society that more and more seems to view humans as not products of a creator, but just accidents of evolution. We don't have any real worth. We don't have any real purpose as human beings. Our world is really not that different from that Egyptian society that we see those Israelites have to suffer through. We're going to look at these three women here again just in a minute. But do you know what makes murder wrong? You know why murder is said to be wrong from the very beginning? Genesis chapter 9, verse 6 says, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man." All people, born and unborn, are created in God's image. Every life is valued by God. Society at large, again, believes that unborn lives don't matter. It'd be better if those who are not wanted, if we just euthanized them and got rid of them before they're a problem to our society, before they infringe on the conveniences that we have in this life, let's just get rid of them and then it won't be an issue that we have to deal with. There is only one victim in abortion. When someone is pressured, if someone were to be pressured somebody hires an assassin to kill somebody. Okay, let's think about that. Somebody hires an assassin to kill somebody, and there's some others that are involved in that conspiracy or encouraging that to take this person out. That's a problem, okay? If that's found out and revealed, you know who's guilty of murder there? The assassin's guilty of murder, certainly. The one who commissioned that assassin is guilty of murder, absolutely. And all of those who were involved in that conspiracy can also be tried and held guilty of that murder. They are guilty of that murder from a legal perspective. When a mother hires a doctor to kill her baby because of the pressure from people in her life, all of them are guilty. Let's talk about these women. The first two that we just read about, Shiphrah and Puah, they defied the king's order. They defied the government in order to be in keeping with the righteousness that God required. And to do anything else would have made them complicit in the wickedness that was taking place in that society. These women are commended by God for standing up for the lives of these children who Pharaoh had declared must be put to death. But the woman I really want us to focus on is in this next chapter. She was a mother who lived during this time. Her name was Jochebed. And we don't know a lot about her. We know she had 3 great kids, and that certainly speaks well of her. Moses and Aaron and Miriam certainly were used by God in His plan and can be spoken of very highly. Moses especially, I believe, is one of the greatest leaders that has ever existed on this earth, and great servant and friend of God. Again, not a lot we know about Jochebed. We do know a little bit about her marriage. She was married to a man named Amram, and it was actually her nephew. Exodus chapter 6, verse 20 says that Amram married his father's sister, Jochebed. And she bore him Aaron and Moses. The length of Amram's life was 137 years. It's interesting. There was nothing wrong with this at the time. We find out that pretty soon after that, part of God's law is going to include that you're not allowed to marry your aunt. Okay? It's going to be in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 6, says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's blood relative." But that command was not in effect at the time where Jochebed's marriage took place. Okay? The only thing that makes something wrong is the fact that God has a law against it. And so we certainly would not hold that against Jochebed here. Nothing wrong with her marriage at the time. Now, besides that, and what we have in Exodus, there's really only one other place that refers to her, Hebrews 11, and we'll read that in just a minute, where she's commended for her faith. To us, even though there is very little said, she's going to be an example of the value that a mother should place on her child and doing whatever she can to protect that little baby that she has brought into the world and has been tasked with bringing into the world through God's gift. Let's look at Exodus chapter 2. Start reading in verse 1. I know I'm running out of time, but the story here is not very long, so we'll have time to get through it. "A man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. A woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful," King James says goodly, and we're going to look at that word, "she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket and covered it with tar and pitch. She put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister, the baby's sister, stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. She had pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?' Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go ahead.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, because I drew him out of the water." Probably a lot that we could emphasize in this passage. We're going to just call out a couple things here really quickly. First of all, she saw him to be beautiful. King James says goodly. It's not really a word that we use a lot. It's the same word that's used in Genesis chapter 1 as God is creating the world. Each day that He creates something, He says, "This is good." It's that same word, beautiful. This is good, this is good. And at the end He says, "This is very good." And the way that the Hebrew renders that is simply by repeating this word twice in a row for emphasis. Okay? She saw this child as beautiful. He was valued in his perfection as a perfect creation of God. Every child has this quality about them. They are beautiful. A creation of God that we can see in every child that's there. It looks like I'm out of time, so I guess I'm going to have to just cut this short. Let me just jump to the end, all right? I apologize for running out. I guess I spent a little too long at the beginning. She viewed this child in the way that God views children. And the main thing that we can learn from her, not only that, but when she hid this baby in the reeds, that same view, that same compassion, that same perspective. She takes this woman who lives in the context of this wicked Egyptian society, and she's able to look at this baby in the basket and recognize the same thing that this mother saw in that child. Pharaoh's daughter recognizes the beauty of that little baby. And we ought to be able to recognize that same beauty in every person that we interact with in our lives. Every person, every one of us here, every person that we meet is created good. Every person is beautiful. Whether we're righteous or wicked, whether we're born or unborn, we are valued by our Creator, and every one of us is worth saving. We'll finish up a few of these thoughts during the invitation.